Chapter 5. Nikki stood, her back stiff and straight, as Zed, slumped in the chair before her, wept into his hands. She had locked her knees for fear that her legs would give way beneath her. She told herself that she would not allow a single tear to escape her control. She had almost succeeded. When she had invoked the power of Warden, putting the box in play in Richard's name, that power had done something to her. It had, to a degree, countered the damage of the chain fire spell infecting her. When Nikki named Richard the player, completing the links to the power she had invoked, Nikki had suddenly known Kaelin. It was not a rebuilding of her lost memory of Kaelin. That was gone. But rather it was a simple reconnection to the awareness of the reality of Kaelin's existence, to the here and now. For ages, it seemed, Nikki had thought that Richard was deluded in his belief in the existence of a woman no one but he remembered. Even later, when Richard had found the Chainfire book and had proven to them what had really happened, Nikki had at last believed him, but she had based that belief only on her belief in Richard and the facts he had uncovered. It was an intellectual conviction based on indirect evidence alone. That conviction had no basis in her own memories or perceptions. She had no personal recollection of Kaelin, only Richard's memory to go on, his word, and the evidence at hand. In that second-hand manner, she believed in the existence of this woman, Kaelin, because she believed Richard. But now Nikki knew, really knew, that Kaelin was real. Nikki still had no memory of anything about the woman, but she viscerally knew that Kaelin was real, that she existed. She no longer needed to rely on Richard's word to know it. It was self-evident, almost as if she perceived it directly. It was somewhat like remembering meeting someone in the past, but not being able to remember their face. While that person's face would not be recalled, that person's existence was not in doubt. Nikki knew that now, because of the connection to the power of Warden, because of what it had done within her, Kaelin would no longer seem to be invisible. Nikki would be able to see her just as she could see everyone else. The Chainfire spell still resided within Nikki, but Orden had at least partially countered the spell, halted the continuing damage, allowing her to be aware of the truth. Her memory of Kaelin was still not vital, but Kaelin was. Nikki now knew, really knew, that Richard's love was real. Nikki felt an aching joy for Richard's heart, even as her own had broken. He stepped up close beside her and did something Nikki could never have imagined a Mord Sith doing. She put an arm gently around Nikki's waist, drawing her close. At least it was something no Mord Sith would ever have done until Richard had come along. Richard had changed everything. Kara, like Nikki, had been brought back from the brink of madness by Richard's passion for life. The two of them shared a unique understanding of Richard, a special connection, a perspective that Nikki doubted anyone else, even Zed, could truly appreciate. More than that, no one but Kara could grasp all that Nikki had just given up. "You did good, Nikki," Kara whispered. Zed rose. "Yes, she did. I'm sorry, my dear, if I've been unfairly hard on you. I can see now that you did, in fact, think it through. You did what you thought was right. I must admit that, given the circumstances, you did the only thing that made sense. I apologize for jumping to foolish assumptions. I've had reason to know many of the profound dangers surrounding the use of the power of Orden. I probably know more about it than anyone alive today. I've even seen the magic of Orden called forth by Dark and Rawl. Because of that, I have a somewhat different view than you've presented. While I don't necessarily completely agree with you, what you did was an act of great intellect and courage, to say nothing of desperation. I'm familiar, too, with acts of desperation in the face of incredible odds, and I can appreciate how they are sometimes necessary. I hope you are right in what you've done. Even if it means I am wrong, I would choose for you to be the one who was right. But it doesn't matter now. Done is done. You have put the boxes of Orden in play and named Richard the player. Despite what I may believe, we are all of a mind in our cause. Now that it is done, we must do our best to see to it that this works. We will all need to do our utmost to help Richard. If he fails, we all fail. All life fails. Nicky couldn't help but feel a certain degree of relief. Thank you, Zed. With your help, we will make this work. He shook his head sadly. My help? Perhaps I'm merely a hindrance. I just wish you had consulted me first. I did, Nicky said. I asked you if you trusted Richard with your life, with all life. What more consultation could there be than that? Zed smiled through the sadness lingering on his face. I guess you're right. It could just be that the combination of the chain fire spell and the contamination of the chimes has already eroded my ability to think. I don't believe that for a moment, Zed. I think it's that you love Richard and are worried for him. I wouldn't have sought your counsel had it not been important. You told me what I needed to know. If you get confused again, Kara said to him, I'll straighten you out. Zed scowled at the woman. How reassuring. Well, Nicky made a long story of it, Kara said, but it's not really all that complicated. Anyone should be able to see it, even you, Zed. Zed frowned. What do you mean? Kara shrugged one shoulder. We are the steel against steel. Lord Rahl is the magic against magic. To Kara, it was no more complicated than that. Nicky wondered if the Mord Sith didn't really grasp that she was only scratching the surface, or if she understood the entire concept better than anyone. Perhaps she was right, and it really wasn't any more complicated than that. Zed laid a hand gently on Nicky's shoulder. It reminded her of Richard's gentle touch. Well, despite what Kara says, this may be the death of us all. If it is to have a chance to work, though, we have a lot of work to do. Richard is going to need our help. You and I know a great deal about magic. Richard knows next to nothing. Nicky smiled to herself. He knows more about it than you think he does. It was Richard who deciphered the taint in the chain fire spell. None of us understood all that business about the language of symbols, but Richard picked it up on his own. By himself, he learned to understand ancient drawings, designs, and emblems. I could never teach him anything about his gift, but he often surprised me with how much he grasped that was beyond the conventional understanding of magic. He taught me things I could never have imagined. Zed was nodding. He drives me crazy, too. Rika, the other Mord Sith living at the Wizard's Keep, stuck her head in the doorway. Zed, I just thought you ought to know about something. She pointed a finger skyward. I was a few levels up, and there must be some kind of broken window or something. The wind is making a strange noise. Zed frowned. What kind of noise? Rika put her hands on her hips and stared at the floor, thinking it over. I don't know. She looked up again. It's hard to describe. It reminded me a little of wind blowing through a narrow passage. A howling noise? Zed asked. Rika shook her head. No, more the way it sounds out on the ramparts when the wind blows through the crenellations. Nicky glanced toward the windows. It's just dawn. I've been casting webs. The wind hasn't come up yet. Rika shrugged. I don't know what it could have been then. The keep sometimes makes noises when it breathes. Rika wrinkled her nose. Breathes? Yes, the wizard said. When the temperature changes, like now when the nights are getting colder, the air down in the thousands of rooms will move around. Forced into the constrictions of the passageways, it sometimes moans through the halls of the keep when there is no wind outside. Well, I haven't been here long enough to have experienced such a thing, but that must be it then. The keep must be breathing. Rika started away. Rika, Zed called, waiting for her to halt. What were you doing up there in that section anyway? Chase is looking for Rachel. Rika said, back over her shoulder. "I was just helping out. You haven't seen her, have you?" Zed shook his head. "And not this morning. I saw her last night before she went off to bed." "All right, I'll tell Chase." Rika peered into the room a moment, and then leaned a hand against the doorway. "What's that thing on the table, anyway? What are you three up to?" "Trouble," Kara said. Rika nodded knowingly. "Magic." "You have that right," Kara said. Rika tapped the palm of her hand against the doorframe. "Well, I'd better go find Rachel before Chase finds her first and gives her a talking to for going off exploring in such a place. That child is a born keep rat," Zed sighed. "Sometimes I think she knows the keep as well as I do." "I know," Rika said. "I've been on patrol and have come across her in places I couldn't believe. Once I thought for certain that she had to be lost. She insisted she wasn't. I made her lead me back to prove it. She marched back to her room without ever making a wrong turn, then grinned up at me and said, 'See?'" Smiling, Zed scratched his temple. "I had a similar experience with her. Children are quick to learn such things. Chase encourages her to learn things, to know where she is so that she isn't so easily lost. I guess, since I grew up here, that's why I don't get lost in the place." She turned toward the hallway, but then turned back when Zed called her name. "The wind noise?" He waggled a finger toward the ceiling. "You said it was up there?" Rika nodded. "Do you mean the speckled hallway that runs past the row of libraries? The place with the sitting areas spaced along the hall outside the rooms?" "That's the place. I was checking the libraries for Rachel. She likes to look through books. As you said, it must be the keep, breathing. And the only problem is that that's one of the several areas where the keep doesn't tend to make any sound when it breathes. The dead ends off that hall divert the movement of air elsewhere, preventing enough air moving through that area fast enough to make much of a sound. It might have been coming from farther away, and I only thought it was in those halls." Zed planted a fist on one bony hip as he considered. "And you say it sounded like a howling sound?" "Well, now that I think about it, it seemed more of a growl." Zed's brow creased. "A growl?" He crossed the thick carpet and poked his head out of the doorway, listening. "Well, not a growl like an animal," Rika said. "More of a rolling rumble. Like I mentioned, it reminded me of the sound the wind makes going through the crenellations. You know, a rumbling, fluttering kind of sound." "I don't hear anything," Zed muttered. Rika made a face. "Well, you can't hear it way down here." Nicky met them at the doorway. "Then why do I feel something vibrating in the center of my chest?" Zed stared at Nicky for a moment. "Perhaps something to do with all the conjuring involving the box?" Nicky shrugged. "Could be, I suppose. I've never dealt with some of those elements before. Much of it was new to me. There is no telling what some of the ancillary effects might be." "Do you remember when Friedrich accidentally set off that alarm?" he asked, turning to Rika. She nodded. "Did it sound anything like that?" Rika shook her head adamantly. "Not unless you put the alarm underwater." "The alarms are constructed magic." Zed rubbed his chin in thought. "You can't put them underwater." Kara spun her agiel up into her fist. "Enough talk." She pushed between them to make it through the doorway. "I say we go have a look." Zed and Rika followed after her. Nicky didn't. She gestured toward the box of ordnance sitting on the table within a glowing web of light. "I'd better stay close." Besides watching over the box, she needed to study the Book of Life, along with other volumes, further. There were still parts of Ordenic theory that she hadn't been able to fully understand. She was distracted by a number of unanswered questions. If she was eventually to be of any help to Richard, she would need to know the answers to those questions. What concerned her most was an issue at the center of Ordenic theory having to do with the connections between Orden and the subject of the Chainfire event, Kalen. Nicky needed to better understand the nature of requirements for connections based on primary foundations. She needed to fully grasp how those foundations were established. She was troubled by the constraints on predetermined protocols, their need of a sterile field in order to recreate memory. She also needed to learn more about the precise conditions in which the forces needed to be applied. At the center of it all, though, was that cautionary requirement of a sterile field. She needed to understand the precise nature of the sterile field Orden required, and more importantly, why Ordenic protocols needed it. "I have all the shields up," Zed told her. "The entrances to the keep are sealed. If anyone had entered without permission, alarms would be going off all over the place. We'd all be plugging our ears until we found the cause." "There are gifted people who know about such things," Nicky reminded him. Zed didn't need to consider for long. "You have a point. Considering all that's going on and all we don't yet know, we can't be too careful. It wouldn't be a bad idea for you to keep an eye on the box." Nicky nodded as she followed them out of the doorway. "Let me know as soon as all is clear." The towering hall outside, while not more than a dozen feet wide, rose nearly out of sight high overhead. The passageway formed a long, narrow rift deep within the mountain down in the lower part of the keep. To the left side rose a natural rock wall that had been chiseled right out of the granite of the mountain itself. Even thousands of years later, the marks left by cutting tools could still be seen. The wall on the side with the rooms was made up of tightly fit, enormous stone blocks. They formed the wall opposing the chiseled granite, both rising up together 60 or more feet. That seemingly endless split through the mountain constituted part of the boundary of the containment field. The rooms within the containment area were all lined up along the very outer edge of the keep that rose up out of the mountain itself. Nicky followed the others only a short way through the seemingly endless hall, watching them until they reached the first intersection. "This is no time to get sloppy or lenient," she called after them. "Too much is at risk." Zed accepted her warning with a nod. "We'll be back after I look into it." Kara cast Nicky a look back over her shoulder. "Don't worry, I'll be there, and I'm not in the mood to be lenient. In fact, I'm not going to be in a good mood again until I see Lord Rawle alive and safe." "You have good moods?" Zed asked as they hurried away. Kara scowled at him. "I'm frequently cheerful and pleasant. Are you suggesting that I'm not?" Zed held up his hands in surrender. No, cheerful described you perfectly." "Good then. In fact, cheerful would come even before bloodthirsty in my book. Come to think of it, I think I like bloodthirsty even better." Nicky couldn't share the spirit of their banter. She wasn't good at making people laugh. She frequently found herself perplexed by the way Zed and others could ease tension with such exchanges. Nicky knew all too well the nature of the people who were trying to kill them. She had once been one of those people of the Order. She had been as merciless as she had been deadly. She had never once seen Emperor Jagang being jovial or light-hearted. He was hardly a man given to repartee. She had spent a great deal of time with him, and he was never anything but consistently lethal. His cause was deadly serious to him, and he was fanatically dedicated to it. Knowing the kind of people coming for them, people like she herself had once been, and understanding their heartless nature, Nicky didn't feel that she could be any less serious than they. She watched Zed, Kara, and Rika hurry down the first hall to the right, heading for the stairway. As they started up, Nicky suddenly understood the sound, the vibration she felt. It was an alarm of sorts. She knew why Rika didn't recognize it. She opened her mouth to call out to the others, just as the world seemed to come grinding to a halt. A dark cloud poured down the stairwell. It was like a million-speckled suggestion of a snake in midair, rolling, turning, twisting, thinning, thickening as it came roaring down the stairwell. The rolling, fluttering rumble was deafening. Thousands of bats poured around the corner, a fat snake of them in midair, a thing alive made up of untold numbers of the little creatures. The sight of so many thousands of them coalesced into a single moving shape was riveting. The racket reverberated off the walls, filling the split in the mountain with a riot of noise. The bats seemed to be flying in a panic, their fused form coiling around the corner in a rush as they bolted from something. Zed, Kara, and Rika seemed frozen where they had begun to climb the stairs. And then the fleeing bats were gone, driven before some terror coming through the keep behind them. The soft, fluttering sound they left in their wake echoed its muted alarm through the hall as the bats fled into deeper darkness. That distant sound was what Rika had heard, but not understood. Staring at the stairs from where the bats had come, Nikki felt as if she were frozen and immobile in an expectant, silent moment in time, waiting to breathe, waiting for something unimaginable. With a rising sense of panic, she realized that, in fact, she really couldn't move. And then a dark shape came sweeping down the stairs like an ill wind. Yet, at the same time, it inexplicably appeared to hang motionless. It seemed composed of swirling black shapes and flowing shadows, creating an inky eddy of obscurity. The dizzying shape of it, the entwining currents of darkness, implied movement that it didn't have. Nikki blinked, and it was gone. She urgently renewed her effort to move, but she felt as if she was suspended in warm wax. She could breathe to a small extent and make headway, but only in the most impossibly slow fashion. Every inch took monumental effort and seemed to take an eternity. The world had become impossibly thick as everything slowed toward a halt. In the passageway, just behind the others in the hall at the bottom of the stairs, the shape appeared again, suspended in mid-air above the stone floor. It looked like a woman in a flowing black dress floating underwater. Even in the midst of growing terror, Nikki found the exotic sight strangely fascinating. The others, with the intruder already past them, were in mid-stride ascending the stairs, as still as if caught in a painting. The woman's wiry black hair lifted lazily out all around her bloodless face. The loose fabric of the black dress swirled as if in whirls of water. Within the slow turbulence of black cloth and hair, the woman herself seemed nearly unmoving. It looked like nothing so much as if she were floating under murky water. Then the figure was gone again. No, not underwater, Nikki realized. In the sliff. That's how Nikki felt, too. It was that kind of strange, otherworldly, suspended sensation of drifting. It was impossibly slow and at the same time blindingly fast. The figure suddenly appeared again, closer this time. Nikki tried to call out, but she couldn't. She tried to lift her arms to cast a web, but she drifted too slowly. She thought it might take an entire day just to lift her arm. Sparkling shards of light glimmered and flashed in the air between Nikki and the others. Magic, she knew, cast by the wizard. It fell far short of the intruder. Even though the brief spate of power sputtered out without having any effect, Nikki was astounded that Zed had managed to ignite it at all. She had tried much the same thing without any result. Dark trailers of cloth drifted, fluidly flapping through the hallway. Snaking shapes and shadows curled around as they moved ever so slowly. The figure wasn't walking or running. It glided, floated, flowed, almost unmoving within the swirling cloth of the dress. Then it was gone again. In a blink, it reappeared, much closer yet. The ghost-like skin stretched tight over a bony face looking as if it had never been touched by sunlight. Snarls of weightless black hair rose up with wisps of the flowing black dress. It was as disorienting a sight as Nikki had ever seen. She felt as if she were drowning. Panic welled up in her at the feeling of not being able to breathe fast enough, of trying to get the air she needed. Her burning lungs were unable to work any faster than the rest of her. When Nikki focused her gaze, the figure of the woman was gone. It occurred to her that her eyes, too, were too slow. The hallway was empty again. It seemed that her focus could not keep up with the movement. Nicky thought that maybe she was having some kind of hallucination brought on by the spells she had cast, by the power of Orden she had tapped into. She wondered if it could be some kind of after-effect of the spells. Maybe it was Orden itself come to claim her for tampering with such forbidden powers. That had to be it. Something to do with all the dangerous things she had conjured. The woman appeared again, as if floating up through the murky deep, emerging suddenly into view out of the dark abyss. This time, Nicky could clearly see the woman's austere, angular features. Blanched blue eyes fixed on Nicky as if there was nothing else in her world. That scrutiny touched Nicky's very soul with icy dread. The woman's eyes were so pale that they seemed as if they had to be sightless. But Nicky knew that this woman could see just fine, not only in the light, but also in the blackest cave, or under a rock where the light of day never touched her. The woman smiled as wicked a grin as Nicky had ever seen. It was the smile of someone who had no fear, but enjoyed causing it. A woman who knew that she had everything under her mastery. It was a smile that sent a slow shiver through Nicky. And then the woman was gone. In the distance, more of Zed's magic sparked and sputtered briefly before it died out. Nicky struggled to move, but the world was too thick, the way it sometimes felt in those terrible dreams she had. Dreams where she struggled to move but simply couldn't, despite how hard she tried. It was the dream where she was trying to run from Jagang. He was always close, coming for her, reaching for her. He was like death itself, intent on the most unimaginable cruelty as he came toward her. She always wanted desperately to run in those dreams, but despite extraordinary effort, her legs wouldn't move nearly fast enough. Those dreams always put her in a state of trembling panic. It was a dream that made death so real she could taste its terror. She'd had that dream one time in camp. Richard had been there. He woke her, asking what was wrong. She gasped back tears as she told him. He cupped her face and told her that it was only a dream, and she was all right. She would have given anything to have had him hold her in his arms and tell her that she was safe. But he didn't. Still, his hand on her face, covered with both of hers, and his gentle words, his empathy, had been a comfort that calmed her terror. This, though, was no dream. Nicky tried to gasp a breath, to call out to Zed, but could do neither. She tried to call her Han, her gift, but couldn't seem to connect to it. It was as if her gift was impossibly fast and she was impossibly slow. The two wouldn't mesh. The woman, her flesh the pallid color of the freshly dead, her hair and dress as black as the underworld, was suddenly right there, right beside Nicky. The woman's arm floated out, reaching through the swirling black cloth. Parched flesh stretched tightly over her knuckles served to emphasize the skeleton beneath. Her bony fingers brushed along the underside of Nicky's jaw. It was a haughty touch, an arrogant act of triumph. At the touch, the vibration in Nicky's chest felt as if it might tear her apart. The woman laughed, a hollow, slow, burbling, underwater laugh that echoed painfully through the stone halls of the keep. Nicky knew without doubt what the woman wanted, what she had come for. Nicky tried desperately to ignite her power, to grab the woman, to lunge, to do anything to stop her. But she could do nothing. Her power seemed impossibly distant, crackling so far away that it would take forever to reach it. As the finger brushed along the length of Nicky's jaw, the woman was gone again, vanishing gently back into the dark depths. The next time she appeared, she was back at the brass-clad doors standing open to the room with the box. The woman drifted through the doorway, her feet never touching the ground, her dress washing lightly all around her. Again she vanished out of Nicky's focus. The next time she appeared, she was between the room and Nicky. She had the box of Orden under an arm. As that terrible laughter echoed through Nicky's mind, the world melted into blackness. Chapter 6. Rachel didn't know who the horse belonged to, and she didn't really care. She wanted it. She had been running all night, and she was exhausted. She had never stopped to consider why she might be running. It somehow didn't seem important. It mattered only that she keep going, keep making progress. She needed to hurry. She needed to keep going. She needed to go faster. She needed the horse. She was certain of the direction in which she had to go. She didn't know why she felt so certain about it. She didn't give that matter any serious thought. It remained only a question from somewhere deep in the back of her mind that never completely surfaced into full conscious concern. As she crouched in the dry, brittle brush, she tried to remain still as a shadow as she figured out what to do. It was hard to stay still because she was so cold. She tried not to shiver for fear of giving herself away. She wanted to rub her arms, but she knew not to because any movement might draw attention. As cold as she was, what concerned her the most was getting the horse. Whoever owned the horse didn't seem to be nearby at the moment. At least, if he was, she couldn't see him. He might be sleeping in the long brown grass and be too low for her to see where he was. He might be off scouting. Or he might be waiting, watching for her, maybe with an arrow nocked and at the ready so that once she bolted from cover, he could take aim and shoot her down. As scary as such a thought was, her fear of such a thing couldn't compare to her need to keep going, her need to hurry. Rachel checked the sun off through the thick stand of trees, checking her bearings, making sure she knew the direction she needed to go. She surveyed her choices of escape routes. There was a wide path, not quite a road, that would be a good place for a fast getaway. There was also a shallow, gravel-bottomed stream that ran through part of the open meadow. On the other side of the meadow, the stream joined the road and ran beside it, as both made their way southeast through the trees. The sun, low, huge-looking, and red, hung just above the horizon. The color matched the color of the scratches all over her arms from running through the brush. Before Rachel realized it, before she had finished thinking it through, her legs were moving. They almost seemed to have a mind of their own. Only a few steps out of the brush, she was running, bolting out across the open ground toward the horse. Out of the corner of her eye, Rachel caught sight of the man as he suddenly sat up in the tall grass. Just as she had suspected, he had been sleeping. With his leather vest and studded straps holding knives, he looked like one of those Imperial Order men. He appeared to be alone, probably on a scouting mission. That's what Chase had taught her. Imperial Order troops, out alone, were likely scouts. She didn't really care who he was. She wanted the horse. She thought that maybe she should be afraid of the man, but she wasn't. She was afraid only of not getting the horse, of not hurrying. The man threw his blanket aside as he shot to his feet. He scrambled into a dead run. He was coming fast, but Rachel's legs had grown long over the summer, and she was a fast runner. The soldier yelled at her. She paid him no never mind as she raced toward the bay mare. The man threw something at her. She saw it streak by over her left shoulder. It was a knife. At such a distance, she knew that it had been a foolish throw, a throw and pray, as Chase called it. He had taught her to focus, to aim. He taught her a lot about knives. She also knew that a running target was difficult to hit with a knife. She was right. The knife missed her by a good margin. With a soft thunk, it stuck in a fallen log lying along the way between her and the horse. She yanked the knife out of the rotting log as she ran by and stuck it through her belt as she slowed. The knife was hers now. Chase had taught her to take the enemy's weapons whenever possible and be prepared to use them, especially if the weapon was superior to what she had. He had taught her that in a survival situation, she had to use whatever was at hand. Gulping air, she ran under the horse's nose, snatching up the loose ends of the reins, but they were tied to a branch of the fallen log. Her fingers worked frantically to undo the tight knot, but they were numb with cold. They slipped on the leather as she clawed at it. She wanted to scream with frustration, but instead she kept tugging, working the knot. It seemed to take forever to get it loose. As soon as the reins were free, she gathered them together in one hand. It was then that she noticed the saddle not far away. She glanced up as the man yelled again, calling her a name. He was coming fast. She wouldn't have near enough time to even think about saddling the horse. Saddlebags, probably full of supplies, leaned against the saddle. She slipped her arm under the flat piece of leather connecting the two sides and ducked under the startled horse's neck. Rounding the far side, she grabbed a fistful of mane and hung on tightly to help her vault up onto the animal's bare back. The saddlebags were heavy, and she almost dropped them, but she held on tight and pulled them up behind her. Even though the horse hadn't been saddled, at least it had on its bridle. Somewhere in the dim recesses of her mind, Rachel relished the warmth of the animal. She laid the hefty packs across the horse's withers in front of her legs. There would be food and water inside. She would need both if she was to be able to continue for long. She just assumed that it would be a long journey. The horse snorted, tossing its head. Rachel didn't take the time to gentle the animal as Chase had taught her. She laid the reins over as she thumped the horse's ribs with her heels. The horse danced sideways, not sure about its strange new rider. Rachel glanced over her shoulder and saw the man almost there. Holding a fistful of mane tightly with one hand and the reins with the other, Rachel leaned forward and again thumped her heels into the horse's sides farther back. The horse bolted into a dead run. The man, cursing, made a frantic dive for the bridle. Rachel jerked the reins to the side, and the horse followed. The soldier flew past them and landed on his face, grunting with the force of the impact. Suddenly seeing the thundering hooves so close, he cried out, his anger switching to fright as he rolled out of the way. He missed being trampled by inches. Rachel felt no sense of triumph. She felt only the compulsion to hurry, to run southeast. The horse obliged. She guided the racing mare to the stream at the far side of the grassy clearing. Trees closed in around them as they ran up the wide swath of shallow water. The man disappearing far behind. Water splashed as the horse ran. The gravel bottom seemed to suit the horse's gait. Chase had taught her how to use water to hide her tracks. Every galloping stride was one stride closer, and that was all that mattered. Chapter 7. When the soldier walking past the wagons tossed the hard-boiled eggs, Richard caught as many as he could. As soon as he had scooped the rest of them up off the ground, he gathered them all in the crook of his arm and crawled back under the wagon to get out of the rain. It was a cold, miserable excuse for a shelter, but it was still better than sitting in the rain. After having collected his own booty of eggs, John Rock, pulling his chain behind, scurried back under the other end of the wagon. "Eggs again," John Rock said in disgust. "That's all they ever feed us, eggs." "It could be worse," Richard told him. "How?" John Rock demanded, not at all happy about his diet. Richard wiped eggs on his pants, trying to clean the mud off the shells as best he could. "They could be feeding us York." John Rock frowned over at Richard. "York?" "Your teammate who broke his leg," Richard said as he started peeling one of his eggs. "The one Snakeface murdered." "Oh, that York." John Rock considered a moment. "You really think these soldiers eat people?" Richard glanced over. "If they run out of food, they will turn to eating the dead. If they are hungry enough and run out of dead, they will harvest a new crop." "You think they will run out of food?" Richard knew they would, but he didn't want to say so. He had instructed the Daharan forces not only to destroy any supply train from the Old World, but to destroy the Old World's ability to provide for their massive invasion force to the north. "I'm just saying that it could be worse than eggs." John Rock looked at his eggs in a new light, finally grumbling his agreement. As John Rock started in peeling an egg of his own, he changed the subject. "You think they'll make us play Jala in the rain?" Richard swallowed a mouthful of egg before he answered. "Probably, but I'd rather be playing a game and get warm than sit here freezing all day." "I suppose," John Rock said. "Besides," Richard told him, "the sooner we can start defeating the teams come for the tournaments, the sooner we work our way up in the standings, and the sooner we get to play the Emperor's team." John Rock grinned at that prospect. Richard was starving, but he forced himself to slow down and savor the meal. As they peeled shells and ate in silence, he kept an eye on the activity in the distance. Even in the rain, men were busy at every sort of work. The sound of hammers at forges rang through the drone of rain and clamor of conversation, yelling, arguing, laughing, and orders being shouted. The vast encampment spread across the flat Azrith plain to what Richard could see of the horizon. Sitting on the ground, it was hard to see a great deal of the larger camp out beyond. He could see wagons, and a little farther away the larger tents in the middle distance. Horses rode past, while wagons pulled by mules made their way through the milling masses. Men on foot, looking miserable in the rain, stood in lines waiting for food at cook tents. In the distance, the People's Palace, sitting on a high plateau, towered over everything. Even in the murk of the gray day, the magnificent stone walls, grand towers, and tiled roofs of the palace stood out above the grimy army come to destroy it. With the steamy vapor rising from the Imperial Order camp, along with the rain and the overcast, the plateau and the palace atop it looked like a distant, noble apparition. There were times when cloud and mist drew across like a curtain, and the entire plateau vanished in the gray gloom, as if it had seen enough of the seething horde come to defile it. There was no easy way for any enemy to attack the palace high on the plateau. The road up the side of the cliff walls was far too narrow for any kind of meaningful assault. Besides that, there was a drawbridge that Richard was certain would have already been raised, and even if it weren't, there were massive walls at the top that were formidable in their own right, and little space outside of them to gather any meaningful assault force. Except in times of war, the People's Palace drew commerce from all over Tahara. Supplies for all the people living there were constantly being brought in. Because it was a trade center, great numbers of people came to the palace to buy and sell goods. For all those people, the primary way up to the city palace was through the inside of the plateau itself. Stairs and walkways accommodated the large number of visitors and vendors. There were also wide ramps for horses and wagons. Because so many people traveled up the inside of the plateau, there were shops and stands all along the way. Large numbers of people came for those market stands and never made the journey all the way up to the city at the top. The entire inside of the plateau was honeycombed with rooms of every sort. Some of the interior spaces were public, but some were not. There were large numbers of soldiers of the first file, the palace guard, barracked there. The problem, from the perspective of the Imperial Order, was that the great doors to those inner access areas were closed. Those doors had been made to stand against any kind of attack, and there were enough supplies stored inside for a long siege. Outside, the Azrith Plain was not at all a hospitable place for forces to gather for a siege. While deep wells inside the plateau provided water for the inhabitants, outside on the Azrith Plain there was no steady supply of water nearby, except the occasional rain, and there was no close source of firewood. On top of that, the weather out on the plain was harsh. The Imperial Order did have plenty of gifted with them, but they couldn't be much help in breaching the palace defenses. The very construction of the palace was in the form of a protection spell that magnified the power of the ruling Lord Rawl, while at the same time hindering the power of others. Inside that plateau, and in the city atop it, the ability of any gifted but a Rawl was severely blunted by that spell. Because he was a Rawl, such a spell would ordinarily be a benefit for Richard, if it were not for the fact that he had somehow been cut off from his gift. He was pretty sure how that had been accomplished. Chained to a wagon, in the middle of an enemy force numbering in the millions, though he couldn't do a whole lot about it. Other than the plateau and the palace atop it, the thing that stood out highest of all out on the Azrith plain was the ramp that the Imperial Order was constructing. Without an easy way to attack the seat of power of the Daharan Empire, the last obstacle standing in the way of their total domination of the New World, Jagang had apparently come up with a plan to build an enormous ramp to get enough forces to the top of the plateau to breach the walls. He planned not simply to besiege the People's Palace, but to assault it. At first, Richard had thought such a task impossible, but as he had studied what Jagang's army was doing, he'd quickly become disheartened to realize that it just might work. While the plateau was an imposing height, towering high above the Azrith plain, the Imperial Order surrounding it had millions of men to devote to the undertaking. From Jagang's perspective, this was his last objective, the last place he needed to crush in order to establish the unopposed rule of the Imperial Order. As far as the Emperor was concerned, he had no other battles to fight, no more armies to destroy, no more cities to capture. The city on top of the plateau was all that stood in their way. The Imperial Order, the brutes who enforced the faith demanded by the Fellowship of Order, could not allow the people of the New World to live outside the control of the Order, because it put the lie to the teachings of their spiritual leaders. The Brothers of the Order taught that individual choice was immoral, because it was ruinous to mankind. The very existence of a prosperous, independent, free people stood in stark contrast to the foundational doctrines of the Order. The Order had condemned the people of the New World as selfish and evil, and required them to convert to the beliefs of the Order or die. Having millions of soldiers with time on their hands as they waited to enforce faith in the Order's beliefs was no doubt troublesome. Jagang had found a task to keep them all busy, a sacrifice to the cause. They were all now devoted to working in shifts every hour of the day and night at the construction of the ramp. While Richard couldn't see the men down lower, he knew that they had to be digging dirt and rock. As those excavation pits grew ever larger, other men carried the dirt to the side of the ramp. In such massive numbers, working without pause, they were up to such a daunting undertaking. Richard hadn't been in the camp for long, but he imagined that day by day he would soon be able to see the sloping ramp growing inexorably toward the top of the plateau. "How will you die?" John Rock asked. Richard was sick of watching the distant ramp, of contemplating the dark and savage future the Order would enforce on everyone. John Rock's question, though, wasn't exactly a ray of sunshine in the gloom. Richard slumped back against the inside of the wheel on the far side of the wagon as he ate eggs. "You think I will have a choice?" he finally asked. "Your say in the matter?" Richard rested a forearm over his knee, gesturing with half an egg. "We make choices about how we will live, John Rock. I don't think we have nearly so much say about how we will die." John Rock looked surprised by the answer. "You think we have a choice about how we live? Reuben, we have no choice." "We have choices," Richard said without explanation. He popped the half of an egg in his mouth. John Rock lifted the chain attached to his collar. "How can I make any choice?" He gestured out at the encampment. "They are our masters." "Masters?" "They have chosen not to think for themselves, and instead to live according to the teachings of the Order. In so doing, they are not even the masters of their own lives." John Rock shook his head in astonishment. "Sometimes, Reuben, you say the strangest things. I am a slave. I am the one with no choice, not them." "There are chains stronger than those attached to the collar around your neck, John Rock. My life means a great deal to me. I would give my life to save the life of someone I hold dear, someone I value. Those men out there have chosen to sacrifice their lives to a mindless cause that produces only suffering. They have already given up their lives and gotten nothing of any value in return. Is that choosing to live? I don't think so. They wear chains that they have put around their own necks. Chains of a different kind, but chains nonetheless. I fought when they came to take me. The Imperial Order won. Now I am chained here. Those men live, but if we try to be free, we will die. Richard wiped the remaining bits of shell off an egg. We all have to die, John Rock. Every one of us. It's how we choose to live that matters. After all, it's the only life each one of us will ever have, so how we live is of paramount importance. John Rock chewed for a moment as he thought it over. Finally, with a grin, he seemed to dismiss the whole matter. Well, if I do end up having to choose how I will die, I wish it to be to the cheers of the crowd for how well I played the game. He glanced over at Richard. And you, Reuben, if you have to choose? Richard had other things on his mind, important things. I hope not to have to decide the matter this day. John Rock sighed heavily. The eggs looked tiny in the man's meaty fists. Maybe not today, but I think this place is the end of the games. I think that in this place we finally lose our lives. Richard didn't answer, so John Rock spoke again into the drone of the downpour. I'm serious. He frowned. Reuben, are you listening? Or are you still dreaming about that woman you think you saw when we came into camp yesterday? Richard realized that he was, and that he was smiling. Despite everything, he was smiling. Despite how true John Rock's words were, that they very well might die in this place, he was smiling. Still, he didn't want to discuss Kalen with the man. I saw a lot of things when we rolled into this camp. Soon enough after the games, John Rock said, and if we do well, there will be women enough. Snakeface has promised us. But now there are just soldiers and more soldiers. You must have been seeing phantoms yesterday. Richard stared off at nothing, nodding. I guess you're far from the first to think that she's a phantom. John Rock heaved a length of chain out of his way and scooted closer to Richard. Reuben, you'd better get your head straight, or we're going to get ourselves killed before we even get a chance to play the Emperor's team. Richard looked up. I thought you were ready to die. I don't want to die. Not today, anyway. There you go, John Rock. You have made a choice. Even chained up, you have made a choice about your life. John Rock shook a thick finger at Richard. Look here, Reuben. If I end up getting killed playing Jala, I don't want it to be because you have your head in the clouds dreaming of women. Just one woman, John Rock. The big man leaned back and flicked eggshells off his fingers. I remember. You said that you saw the woman you want to be your wife. Richard didn't correct him. I just want for us to play well and win all our games so that we can have the chance to play the Emperor's team. John Rock's grin returned. Do you really think we can beat the Emperor's team, Reuben? Do you think we can survive such a game with those men? Richard cracked the shell of another egg on the side of his heel. You're the one who wants to die to cheers of the crowds for how well you've played. John Rock gave Richard a sidelong glance. Maybe I will do as you say and choose to live free. Yes? Richard only smiled before biting the egg in half. Not long after Richard and John Rock had finished the last of their meal, Commander Karg appeared, his boots splashing as he marched toward them through the mud. Get out here, all of you! Richard and John Rock crawled out from under the wagon into the drizzle. Other captives at wagons to either side stood up, waiting to hear what the commander wanted. Soldiers who were on the team gathered closer. We're going to have visitors, Commander Karg announced. What kind of visitors? One of the soldiers asked. The Emperor is turning the teams that arrived for the tournament. Emperor Jagang and I go way back. I expect you to show him that I've done well in selecting a worthy team. Any man who doesn't reflect well on me, or who fails to show the proper respect for our Emperor, will be of no use to me. Without further word, the commander hurried away. Richard could feel himself swaying on his feet as his heart pounded. He wondered if Kalen would be with Jagang, as she had been the day before. While he desperately wanted to see her again, he hated to think of her being anywhere near that man. For that matter, he hated to think of her being anywhere near any of these men. Over the winter, when Nicky had captured Richard and taken him down to the old world, Kalen, in his place, had led the Daharan forces. She was the one responsible for keeping Jagang from having the victory back then that he might otherwise have had. She had been responsible for whittling down the ranks of Order soldiers, even if the endless supplies from the old world had included reinforcements that more than replenished all the men lost. Kaelin had not only delayed the invaders, but earned their undying hatred for all the pain she had inflicted upon them. Were it not for Kaelin, the Order probably would have caught the Daharan army and slaughtered them. She had kept them one step ahead of Jagang and just out of his reach. Trying to look composed, Richard leaned back against the wagon and folded his arms as he waited. Before long, he caught sight of an entourage off to the left, making their way through the encampment. They were moving down the line of teams in the distance, pausing at regular intervals along the way to take a closer look. Judging the types of soldiers Richard could see making up the group, it could be none other than the Emperor that they escorted. Richard recognized the Royal Guard from the day before, when he had rolled through the camp and right past Jagang. That was when he had briefly seen Kaelin. The Emperor's guards were intimidating in their mail and leather, and with their well-made weapons. But it was the size of the men and their bulging, rain-slicked muscles that was truly daunting. These were men who even struck fear into the hearts of the regular brutes of the Order. Those regular troops all fell back well clear of the Royal Guard. Richard didn't imagine that such men were at all tolerant of anything they believed might potentially be a threat to the Emperor. John Rock stepped forward to join the other men waiting in a line for the Emperor to review them. It was when Richard saw Jagang's shaved head off in the center of the ranks of muscled guards that the sudden realization hit him. Jagang would recognize him. Jagang, as a dreamwalker, had been in the minds of various people, and he had seen Richard through their eyes. Richard could hardly believe how careless he had been not to even consider that when he played the Emperor's team in order to get close enough to Kaelin, Jagang would be there, and Jagang would recognize him. Distracted by the thought of actually getting to Kaelin, he hadn't taken such a prospect into consideration. Richard noticed something else then. A sister. It looked like Sister Ulicia, but if it was, she had aged a great deal since he'd last seen her. She was farther away, back at the tail end of all the guards following Jagang, but Richard could still see the sagging creases in her face. The last time he had seen her, she'd been an attractive woman, although Richard had difficulty separating a person's looks from their personality, and Sister Ulicia was one sinister woman. No matter how superficially attractive a person was, a cruel personality tainted Richard's image of them. Corrupt character colored his appraisal of a person to such an extent that he could not see them as attractive, separate from their vicious nature. That was also one of the reasons Kaelin was so beautiful to him. She was not simply stunningly attractive, but exemplary in every way. Her intelligence and insight were matched by her passion for life. It was as if her captivating looks perfectly reflected everything else about her. Sister Ulicia, despite how physically attractive she once had been, now appeared to reflect only the rot at her core. Richard realized then that not only would Jagang and Sister Ulicia recognize him, but there would be other sisters in the camp who also knew him. He suddenly felt very vulnerable. Any of those sisters could happen by at any time. He had nowhere to hide. When he got close enough, Jagang would not fail to see that Lord Rawl, the very man he was after, was right there in his midst. Chained as he was, without his ability to use his horn, even as difficult as it had been for him to call forth his gift when he had had access to it, Richard would be at Jagang's mercy. He had a sickening flash of a vision that Shota, the witch woman, had given him. It had been a vision of being executed. It had been raining in that vision, much as it was raining now. Kaelin had been there. In tearful terror, she had watched as his wrists had been bound behind his back, and he was made to kneel in the mud. As he knelt there, with Kaelin screaming his name, A big brute of a soldier came up behind him, promising to have Kalin for himself, as he brought a long knife around before Richard's face, and then with a mighty effort cut deep through his throat. Richard realized that he was touching his throat, as if to comfort the gaping wound. He was panting in a panic. He felt a hot wave of nausea welling up through him. Was this to be Shota's vision come to life? Was this what she had been warning him about? Was this to be the day he died? It was all happening too fast. He hadn't been ready for this. But what could he have done to get ready? "Reuben!" Commander Carr yelled. "Get up here!" Richard struggled to get control of his emotions. He took a deep breath and worked to calm himself as he started moving, knowing that if he didn't, it was only going to get ugly even faster. Not far away, the clot of men had stopped at the next team up the line. Richard could hear only the murmur of conversation over the sound of rain. His mind raced, trying to think of what he could do before Jagang recognized him. He knew that he couldn't hide behind the other men. He was point man. Jagang would want to see the team's point man. And then he caught a glimpse of Kalin. Richard moved as if in a dream. The whole cluster of men around the Emperor and Kalin had started turning in the direction of Richard and his team. Knowing that he had to get up with the other men, Richard started to step over the chain attached to John Rock's collar. Just then he had an idea. He hurried forward and deliberately let his foot catch the chain. He fell face first in the mud. Commander Karg went red with rage. "Reuben, you clumsy idiot! Get on your feet!" Richard scrambled to his feet as Jagang's guards began parting for the Emperor. Richard stood up tall next to John Rock. With a finger, he wiped mud from his eyes. He blinked to clear his vision. It was then that he spotted Kalin. She was walking just behind Jagang. The hood of her cloak, pulled up to protect her against the rain, partially hid her face. Richard recognized every familiar movement of her body. No one moved quite the way she moved. Their eyes met. He thought his heart might stop. He remembered the first time he had seen her. She had looked so noble in that white dress. He remembered the way she had looked directly at him without speaking, a gaze that was questioning and at the same time guarded, a gaze that instantly and clearly conveyed her intelligence. He had never seen anyone before that moment who looked so valiant. He thought that he had probably been in love with her from that first instant, from that first look into her beautiful green eyes. He had been sure that in that first look into those eyes, he had seen her soul. Now there was all that, along with a hint of confused concern in her expression. Because of the way his gaze fixed on her, followed her, she was aware that he could see her. Being the object of the chain fire spell, she wouldn't remember who he was, or, for that matter, who she was. Other than Richard and the sisters who had taken her prisoner and ignited the chain fire spell, no one could remember her. Obviously, Jagang was not affected by the spell. Richard surmised that it probably had something to do with a connection to the sisters, but Kalin would be invisible to everyone else. She recognized, though, that Richard could see her. In the isolation imposed by the spell, that had to be something profoundly important and meaningful for her. In fact, by the look on her face, he could see that it was. Before Jagang could begin to get close enough to inspect the team, a man called out as he ran up to the group. The Emperor gestured him forward in a manner that suggested the man was well known. The guards parted for him as he made his way through their inner circle of protection. Since he carried only minimal weapons, a couple of knives, Richard reasoned that he was probably a messenger. He was winded, but seemed to be in a great hurry. When he made it to the Emperor, the man bent close, speaking excitedly but in a low voice. At one point in his report, he gestured across the camp toward the area where the construction of the ramp was taking place. Kalin, pulling her gaze from Richard, looked over at the man speaking with Jagang. Richard surveyed a cadre of other guards, closer in, who surrounded her. They weren't the royal guard. and in fact they were careful to stay out of the way of the imposing royal guards. These men looked more like the regular soldiers of the camp. Their weapons weren't well made. They had no chainmail or armor. Their clothes seemed to be a collection of whatever they could find that looked the part of the rest of the army. They were big men, young and strong, but they were not the match of the Emperor's guards. They looked more like common thugs. Richard realized then that they could only be guarding Kaelin. Unlike Jagang's guards, who seemed unmindful of her presence, these men frequently glanced at Kaelin, checking on her every move. That could only mean that these men could see her. Jagang's guards never looked at Kaelin, but these men did. Somehow they were able to see her. Somehow, Jagang had found men to guard her who were not affected by the spell. At first questioning if he was really right that they could see her, and confused by how such a thing was possible, Richard finally realized that it actually did make sense. The chain fire spell, like the world of magic itself, had been contaminated by the chimes. That contamination eroded the ability of magic to function. The whole purpose of the chimes was to destroy magic. Because of the taint left by their presence in the world of life, the chain fire spell's very makeup had been impaired. When Zed and Nikki had run the verification web, Richard had discovered the damage to the structure of the spell itself. Because of that contamination within the chain fire spell, it didn't function as designed. It was flawed. It only made sense that such a flaw might allow a few people to escape its effects. Richard remembered how the plague, sweeping through the population like a wildfire, didn't touch everyone. There were a few people, even some who cared for the sick and dying, who never contracted the plague themselves. This must be something like that. There were bound to be a few people who weren't affected by the chain fire event, and would therefore be able to see Kaelin. It would certainly explain why there were guards who could see her. As those special guards, distracted by the man speaking to Jagang with such urgency, turned to try to see better what was happening with the Emperor, Kaelin made a small move to turn with them. It looked perfectly natural. Richard knew it was anything but. As she turned, Kaelin adjusted the hood of her cloak against the rain, and as her hand came back down, it passed close to one of her guards. Richard saw that the sheath at the man's belt was empty. As Kaelin's hand disappeared back under her cloak, Richard caught a brief glint of reflection off the blade. He wanted to laugh out loud, to cheer, but he didn't dare move a muscle. Kaelin caught him looking at her, and realized that he had to have seen what she'd just done. She watched him a moment to see if he might betray her. She was using the hood of her cloak to hide her face from those guarding her, to prevent them from seeing that she was looking obliquely at Richard. When he didn't move, she turned, and along with the guards watched what was going on between the messenger and the Emperor. Jagang suddenly swung around and started away, returning back the way he'd come, the messenger right on his heels. Kaelin briefly glanced back over a shoulder to catch one last glimpse of Richard before the guards could all close in around the Emperor and his captive. As she did so, and the hood of her cloak moved just enough, Richard saw the dark bruise on her left cheek. Hot anger blazed through him. Every fiber of his being wanted to do something, to act, to get her away from Jagang, to get her out of this camp. His mind raced to come up with something, anything. But chained as he was, there was nothing he could do. This was not the time or place he could act. Worse, he knew that if he did nothing, Jagang's abuse of her would only continue. If he did nothing, and Kaelin suffered worse, Richard knew that he would never forgive himself. Despite how desperately he wanted to do something, though, he could do nothing. He stood silent and still, enduring the rage storming through him, a wrath that was the twin to the sword of truth, the sword he'd given up in order to find Kaelin. Kaelin, the Emperor, and all the guards vanished back into the churning grime of the encampment. Curtains of mist seemed to draw in behind them. Richard stood trembling in bitter frustration. Not even a cold rain could cool his bottled fury. Even as his mind raced through every possible action, he knew that there was nothing he could do. Not now, anyway. At the same time, his heart ached for Kaelin. Agony for what she must be facing at the hands of such a man knotted his insides. His knees felt weak with his fear for her. He had to stiffen his resolve to keep himself from falling to the ground in tears. If only he could get his hands on Jagang. If only... Commander Karg strode up close in front of Richard. "You're lucky," he growled. "The Emperor obviously had more important things to do than review my team and my clumsy point man." "I need some paint," Richard said. Commander Karg blinked in surprise. "What?" "Paint. I need some." "You expect me to fetch paint for you?" "Yes, I told you I need it." "What for?" Richard wagged a finger at the man's face, resisting mightily the urge to whip a length of chain around the commander's neck and strangle the life out of him. "Why do you have those tattoos?" Confused, Commander Karg hesitated for a moment, considering the question as if it might have thorns in it. "To make me look all the more fierce to the enemy," he said at last. "Such a look gives me power. When the enemy sees our men, they see ferocious fighters. It strikes terror into their hearts. When they freeze for a moment in fear, we triumph." "That's why I want the paint," Richard said. "I want to paint the faces of our team so that it strikes fear into the hearts of our opponents. It will help us defeat them. It will help your team to triumph." Commander Karg studied Richard's eyes for a moment, as if to gauge if he was serious or up to something. "I have a better idea," the commander said. "I will have tattoo artists come around and tattoo my entire team." He tapped a finger on the scales covering the side of his face. "I will have them tattoo you all with scales and such all over your faces. It will make you all look like my men. When you all have tattoos like mine, you will look like my team. Everyone will know you belong to me." The commander gave Richard a grim smile, pleased with his idea. "I will have you all pierced as well. You all will have tattoos and metal studs in your faces. You will all look like inhuman animals." Richard waited until the man was finished and then shook his head. "No, that won't do. It's not good enough." Commander Karg planted his fists on his hips. "What do you mean it's not good enough?" "Well," Richard said, "you can't see those kinds of tattoos from far enough away. I'm sure that they work just fine in battle when you are in a face-to-face confrontation with the enemy, but it won't be that way in the Jala games. Such tattoos would too easily be missed. You are often as close on the Jala field as you are in battle," Commander Karg said. "Maybe," Richard conceded, "but I want us to stand out not only to our opponents at the moment, not just to the men on the field, but also to other teams who will be watching, to everyone who is watching. I want everyone to see our painted faces and instantly recognize us. I want such a sight to plant fear in the minds of other teams. I want them to remember us and to worry." Commander Karg folded his muscled arms. "I want you to be tattooed so that you look like my team, so that all will know that it is Commander Karg's team." "And if we lose? If we lose in a humiliating fashion?" The commander leaned in a little as he glared. "Then you will be whipped at the least, and no longer of any use to me at worst. I think you know by now what becomes of captives who are of no use." "If that happens," Richard said, "everyone will remember that the team you put to death for being inferior were all tattooed just like you. If we fail, they will remember the snake pattern of your tattoo on all of us. It would link us to you, but also you to us. If we lose, you will be stigmatized by that tattoo. If we lose, every time they see your tattooed face, they will laugh at you. If we should for some reason happen to lose, paint can be washed off before we are whipped, or worse." Commander Karg was beginning to grasp just what Richard meant. He visibly cooled as he scratched his jaw. "Now see if I can't come up with some paint. Make it red." "Red? Why?" Red stands out. It will be memorable. Red also reminds people of blood. I want them to see us, and before anything else, wonder why we want to look like we are painted in blood. I want the other teams to worry about that the night before a game. I want them to sweat and lose sleep thinking about it. When they finally come to play us, they will be tired, and then we will make them bleed. A slow smile spread on Commander Karg's face. You know, Reuben, were you born on the right side of this war along with me, I bet we would be good friends. Richard doubted that the man truly understood the concept of friendship, or could even appreciate such values. I'll need enough paint for all the men, Richard said. Commander Karg nodded as he started away. You will have it. Chapter 8. Kalen hurried to stay close to Jagang as he marched through the camp, lest he give her a stunning shock of pain through the collar. Of course, as he had demonstrated any number of times, he needed no excuse. She knew, though, that right then she had better not even look like she might give him cause, because he was in a hurry due to the strange news the man had brought. She didn't care so much about the news, though. Her mind was on the man she had finally seen again, the captive who had been brought in the day before. As she moved through the encampment, thinking about the man, she watched not only her guards, but also the common soldiers in the camp, looking for reactions that might indicate that they could see her, listening for any obscene remark that would betray them. All around, startled men stared at the heavily armed group making their way through the midst of their daily life. But she didn't see a single man look directly at her, or show any other signs of seeing her. Despite being men in an army led by the Emperor himself, these men had probably never seen Jagang this close before. The army, all in one place, constituted a population that was larger than almost any city. If these men had ever seen the Emperor before, it was likely only at a great distance. Now, as he passed close by, they stared at him in open awe. Kalen noted in their reaction, and Jagang's attitude toward them, the contradiction to the Order's teachings of the absolute equality of all men. For his part, Jagang never showed any penchant for sharing the common life of his men, their daily existence in the filth and mud. They lived in a camp that was virtually lawless, involved in crimes of every sort with their unruly fellows, while Jagang always enjoyed protection from those theoretically equal to him in every way. Kalen supposed that if they shared one thing, it was that they, like their emperor, lived lives of almost constant, irrational violence and complete indifference to human life. Kalen, invisible to the soldiers all around, stepped carefully over puddles and dung. She clutched the knife tightly in a fist under her cloak, unsure yet exactly what she would do with it. The opportunity to take the knife had suddenly presented itself, and she had acted. In such rough surroundings, it felt good to have a weapon. The encampment was a frightening place, despite how invisible she was to nearly all the soldiers. Even though she knew that she had no hope of using the knife to escape Jagang, all of her special guards, and the sisters, it still felt good to have a weapon. A weapon gave her a modicum of control, a way to defend herself, at least to a degree. More than that, though, a weapon symbolized how much she valued her life. Having it was a declaration to herself that she had not and would not give up. If she had a chance, Kalen would use the knife to try to kill Jagang. She knew that if she were to actually accomplish such a deed, it would mean a sure death for her as well. She knew, too, that the Order would not falter because of the loss of the man. They were like ants. Stepping on one would not send the colony into retreat. Still, she knew that sooner or later she was going to be put to death, and probably made to suffer greatly along the way by Jagang's own hand. She had already seen him murder several people for little or no excuse, so putting an end to him would at least serve to satisfy her sense of justice. Kalen's memory of her past life was gone. Her total awareness since the sisters had taken that memory was that of a world gone mad. She might not be able to set the world right, but if she could kill Jagang, she might be able to see justice done in one little part of it. It wouldn't be easy, though. Jagang was not only physically powerful and skilled at combat, he was a very clever individual. Sometimes Kalen thought that he really could read her mind. In another way, since Jagang was a warrior and he was often able to anticipate what she would do next, Kalen thought that in the past she could not remember, she must have been a warrior too. Alerted by the urgent whispers of their friends, men in the camp all around came out of tents, rubbed sleep from their eyes, and stood in the drizzle staring at the swift procession in their midst. Other men turned from work at caring for animals to watch. Riders reined in their horses to wait until the Emperor passed. Wagons rumbled to a halt. No matter where she was in the camp, it stank. But in among the men, it was a degree worse. The cook fires added greasy soot to the smell of the latrines. She didn't think that the hastily dug latrines were going to be adequate for long. By the foul look of the little streams of water wending their way through the camp, they were already overflowing. The smell proclaimed that she was right. She couldn't imagine how much worse it was going to become over the coming months of the siege. Even with the stench and the revolting sights of some of the things going on in the camp, Kalen noted it all only dimly in the back of her mind. Her thoughts were on other things, or rather, on one thing, that man with the gray eyes. She hadn't known which team he would be with. When she had seen his face the day before, he had been in a cage on a transport wagon. She knew only from catching bits of Jagang's conversations with officers that the cages held some of the men who were on a team come to play in the tournaments. Jagang had been eager to tour the teams before any of the games were to begin. As they went from team to team, she had been looking for the man. At first, she hadn't even realized that she was doing it. She found herself staying close to Jagang as he inspected the players, so that she could also see them. He knew a great deal about some of the teams. He commented to his guards about what he expected he would see before he reached each new team. When he arrived at a new group, he would ask to see the point man, along with the wing men. Sometimes he wanted to have a look at the men of the blocking line. It reminded Kalen of a housewife at market, inspecting cuts of meat. Kalen had searched all the faces she saw, looking at every man. She had not been gauging their height, weight, and muscle as Jagang had been doing. She had found herself looking at their faces, trying to find the man she had seen in the cage the day before. She was beginning to lose heart, thinking that he must not be among the teams. She had begun to suppose that maybe he had ended up being sent to work as slave labor at the ramp site, along with many other captives. And then, when she finally did spot the man, he did the strangest thing. He fell face first into the mud. They were still some distance off, and no one but Kalen had really been looking at him yet. Everyone else thought the man was just clumsy as he tripped over the chain lying there on the ground. As they had approached the team, some of the guards had laughed, whispering among themselves about how quickly such a man was going to get his neck broken on the Jala field. Kalen hadn't thought it was funny, though. She alone had been looking at the man, and she knew that he hadn't tripped accidentally. She knew that it had been deliberate. The fall had looked real enough. No one else imagined that it had been by design. Kalen knew it was. She knew what it was to be a captive and have to instantly do something no matter how risky because you had no choice. She just couldn't imagine why the man had done it. What could be the purpose of such a thing? What danger could he have been trying to avoid? In some circumstances, people did such things to get a laugh, and some of the guards had laughed. But that wasn't the purpose behind what this man had done. To Kalen's mind, it had been not only deliberate, but done with haste, as if he thought of it only a second before, and there was no time to come up with something better. It had been an act of desperation. But why? Why fall on your face in the mud? What could it possibly accomplish? It suddenly hit her. It was in a way something like what she had been doing, using the hood of her cloak to hide what she was doing, where she was looking, who she was looking at. He must have wanted to cover his face. It could only be because he thought that someone would recognize him. It must have been that the man feared that Jagang himself would recognize him, or possibly Sister Alicia. At any rate, it had to be that he was trying to keep from being recognized. She supposed that it did make some sense. After all, the man was a captive. Only enemies of the Order would be captives. She wondered if he was a high-ranking officer or something like that. And he had known Kalen. From the first instant their eyes met the day before, when he had been in that cage, she could see that he recognized her. As she had approached his team with Jagang, she and the man had shared a look. In that look, she saw that they both knew the plight the other was in, and they both had done nothing to betray the other, as if they'd made a silent pact. It lifted Kalen's heart to know that among all these murderous men, there was one who was not an enemy. At least, she didn't think he was. She reminded herself not to substitute her imagination for the truth. With her memory gone, she had no real way of knowing if he was an enemy or not. She supposed that he could be someone who had been hunting her. She wondered if it could be possible that he, like Jagang, had some motive to want to see her suffer. That he was a captive of Jagang didn't automatically mean that he was on her side. After all, the sisters had hardly been on Jagang's side. But if he was trying to hide his face to keep from being recognized, what was going to happen once the Jala game started? He might be able to stay muddy for a day or two, but once the rain stopped, the mud was going to dry up. She wondered what he would do then. She couldn't help feeling a pang of worry for him. At the end of visiting the teams, as they had left to see what the messenger had to show Jagang, she had seen one other thing in the man's eyes: rage. As she had turned back for a last, quick look at him, the hood of her cloak had pulled back, and he had seen the black bruise Jagang had left on her face. Kalen had thought that he looked like he might use his bare hands to rip apart the chain holding him. She was at least relieved that he was smart enough not to try to do anything. Commander Karg would have killed him in a blink. From the conversations between Jagang and the commander, as Jagang had started out to inspect the teams, the two were old acquaintances. They mentioned battles they had been in together. In that brief conversation, she had taken appraisal of the commander. Like Jagang himself, the commander was not a man to be underestimated. Such a man would not have wanted to be embarrassed before his emperor, and would have killed his point man without hesitation had he allowed his anger to slip its bounds. She supposed that it was that, his anger at seeing what Jagang had done to her, that made her think the man could not be her enemy. But the man was dangerous as well. The way he stood, the way he balanced, the way he moved, told Kalen a great deal about him. She could clearly see the intelligence in his raptor gaze. In the measured way he moved, she saw that he was a man not to be underestimated. She would know for sure if she was correct once the game started. But a man like Commander Karg would not have a captive be his point man unless there was a very good reason. Kalen would know soon enough when she saw the man play. But to her he looked like coiled fury, and like he knew how to uncoil. "Over this way, Excellency," the messenger said as he pointed off through the gray drizzle. They followed the messenger, leaving the dark sea of the camp, emerging out onto the open ground of the Azrith Plain. Kalen had been so preoccupied thinking about the man with the gray eyes that she hadn't even noticed that they were coming up on the site of the construction. The ramp rose high overhead. Beyond, the plateau towered above them. Up this close, the plateau truly was imposing. Up this close, she could see far less of the magnificent palace atop it. When it had started to rain, she had hoped that maybe it would cause the ramp to collapse. But she could see, now that they were there beside it, that it was not only reinforced with rock, but being well compacted as material was added. Gangs of men with heavy weights tamped the dirt and rock as it was placed. This was not a haphazard effort. While the soldiers in camp, like the ones guarding her, were little more than ignorant brutes mindlessly devoted to a senseless cause, there were some men among the Imperial Order who were intelligent. They were the ones supervising the construction. The brutes merely handled the dirt. As ignorant and unaware as the general population of soldiers was, Jagang surrounded himself with competent men. His personal guards, as big and powerful as they were hardly idiots. Those overseeing the construction of the ramp were likewise intelligent men. The men supervising the project knew what they were doing and were confident enough to contradict Jagang when he suggested something that wouldn't work. Jagang had initially wanted to make the base of the ramp narrower so that they could build height more quickly. While respectful, they were not afraid to tell him that it wouldn't work, and why. He had listened carefully and, when satisfied that they were right, let them proceed with their plans even though those plans had been contrary to his initial desire. When Jagang thought he was right, though, he was as determined as a bull to have his way. Numerous lines of men, each 12 or 15 men deep, stretched back away from the colossal ramp. Some of the men passed baskets filled with dirt and rock, and some passed back empty baskets. Other men wheeled carts carrying rock. Mules pulled trains of wagons hauling larger rock. The project was massive almost beyond belief. But with so many men constantly adding to it, the ramp grew steadily. Kalen followed as the Emperor hurried through the site, the messenger constantly pointing the way among the confusion of activity. The lines of men parted as the royal procession marched through, then melted back together. As they made their way past throngs of workers, Kalen finally saw the pits where men in astounding numbers dug material for the ramp. There seemed to be countless numbers of vast pits in the ground, each with one sloping end where men were carrying material out as others brought empty baskets, carts, and wagons back down in to be loaded. The array of pits stretched as far as she could see into the gray drizzle. Jagang and his party made their way along the wide tracks between the pits arranged in a grid across the plain. Those pathways between were wide enough to accommodate wagons going in opposite directions. "Down here, Excellency, this is the place." Jagang paused, peering down the long, sloping ramp into the pit. It appeared to be the only excavation that was deserted. He looked around at the other pits nearby. "Clear this one here as well," he said, gesturing at the next pit lying in the direction of the plateau. "And don't start any new digging beyond in the same direction." Some of the supervisors who had gathered hurried to carry out his instructions. "Let's go," Jagang said. "I want to see if this is really something or not." "I'm sure you will find it as I described, Excellency." Jagang ignored the angular messenger as he started down the sloping track into the pit. Kalen stayed close. A glance back revealed Sister Ulicia not a dozen steps behind. The sister, without a hood on her cloak and with her wet hair plastered to her head, did not look at all pleased to be out in the rain. Kalen turned back to watch her footing on the slick, muddy slope. The bottom of the pit was an uneven mess where thousands of men had toiled at digging and loading. Since some of the ground was softer and easier to dig, those places were deeper. In other spots, where it was more rocky and harder to dig, there were mounds nearly twice Kalen's height that had yet to be reduced. Following the messenger through the disorder, Jagang descended into one of the deeper areas. Kalen followed them down into the muck, her guards staying close around her. She wanted to stay close to Jagang in case he became distracted by whatever was in the pit. If she got a chance, no matter the risk, she would try to kill him. The messenger squatted down as they came to a halt. "This is it, Excellency." He slapped his hand on something just peeking up from the ground. Kalen frowned, looking along with everyone else at the smooth expanse that had been exposed. The messenger had been right. It definitely did not look natural. She could see what looked like joints. It did look like a structure buried deep in the ground. "Clean it off," Jagang said to some of the foremen from the project who had come down into the pit. Apparently, as per standing orders, when the structure had been discovered, All work was abandoned, and the workers pulled out until Jagang could personally inspect the find. The shape was slightly rounded, as if they had uncovered the very top portion of a massive, long, rounded shape. As men worked with shovels and brooms, Jagang directing where they dug, it quickly became apparent that the messenger had been accurate in his report. It did look like the exterior of a barrel-vaulted ceiling. As the men cleaned it off, Kalen could see that the structure was made of large stones cut to precise shapes to make up the curve of the arch. It reminded her of nothing so much as a buried building, except that there was no roof, just the exposed outer structure of an interior vaulted ceiling. Kalen could not imagine what such a thing could be doing buried all the way out here on the Azrith Plain. There was no telling how many hundreds or even thousands of years whatever was inside had been entombed. When enough of the dirt and debris had been cleared off, Jagang crouched down and ran his hand over the wet stone. His fingers traced a few of the joints. They were so tight that not even a thin knife blade would have slipped between them. "Get some tools down here, pry bars and such," he said. "I want this opened. I want to know what's down inside it." "At once, Excellency," one of the construction bosses said. "Use your assistants instead of the laborers." Jagang stood, sweeping an arm around the general area. "I want this whole place cordoned off. I don't want any of the regular soldiers anywhere near here. I will have some of my guards stationed here to watch the site at all times. This area is to be as restricted as my own tents." Kalen knew that if any of the soldiers were to get into a tomb, or whatever ancient thing it was that they'd found, they would loot everything of value. The plundered rings he wore said that Jagang knew the same thing. Kalen glanced up when she noticed some of Jagang's guards rushing down the slope into the pit. They pushed their way through the construction foreman and other guards to get in near the Emperor. "We got her!" one of the breathless men reported. Jagang smiled a slow, wicked grin. "Where is she?" The man pointed. "Just up there, Excellency." Jagang glanced briefly at Kalen. She didn't know what he was up to, but the look he gave her ran a chill up her spine. "Bring her down here, now," Jagang told the man. He and another of the guards hurried back up the slope to get whoever it was they had. Kalen could not imagine who the men had been talking about, and why it gave Jagang such satisfaction. As they waited, the construction supervisors continued to expose more of the buried structure. In short order, a stretch of the stone nearly 50 feet long had been exposed. All of it that they had uncovered ran in a straight line, the arch uniform along the entire length. Other men worked at widening the excavation around the smooth stonework. The more of it they uncovered, the more the shape and scale of it came into view. This was no small thing. If the stone really was a ceiling of something beneath, then that room, or tomb, would have to be nearly 20 feet across. Since it showed no sign of terminating, there was no telling how long it was. From what she could see of it, it looked something like a buried hallway. At the sounds of muted cries and a scuffle, Kalen looked up. The big guards were bringing a struggling, slender figure down the muddy slope. Kalen's eyes went wide. Her knees went weak. The men each held a thin, spindly arm of a girl not half their height. It was Jillian, the girl from back in the ancient ruins in the city of Casca, the girl Kalen had helped to escape. Kalen had killed 2 of Jagang's guards and Sister Cecilia so that Jillian could get away. As the guards brought the helpless girl forward, her copper-colored eyes finally caught sight of Kalen. Those eyes filled with tears at all that had been lost, at her failure to evade the men of the Order. The guards brought her in close and stood her up before the Emperor. "Well, well," Jagang said with a shallow, gruff chuckle. "Look what we have here." "I'm sorry," the girl whispered up at Kalen. Jagang glanced over at Kalen. "I've had men searching for your little friend here. Quite the dramatic escape you pulled off for her. Jagang cupped Jillian's chin, his thick fingers squeezing her cheeks. Too bad it was all for nothing. Kalen thought that it wasn't for nothing. She had at least killed 2 of his guards and Sister Cecilia. She had at least done her best to gain freedom for Jillian. She had tried her best. Her efforts had cost her dearly, but she would do the same thing again. Jagang seized the girl's thin arm in his big hand and pulled her forward. Again he grinned at Kalen. "Do you know what we have here?" Kalen didn't answer. She was not about to join his game. "What we have here," he said in answer to his own question, "is someone who can help you behave." She gave him a blank look and didn't ask. Jagang unexpectedly pointed at the waist of one of Kalen's special guards, the one standing just to her right. "Where's your knife?" The man looked down at his belt as if he was afraid a snake might be about to sink its fangs into him. He looked back up from the empty scabbard. "Excellency, I must have lost it." Jagang's icy look made the man's face pale. "You lost it, all right." Jagang spun and backhanded Jillian hard enough to send her flying through the air. She landed in the mud, screaming in shock and pain. A red stain spread in the puddle around her face. Jagang turned back to Kalen and held out his hand. "Give me the knife." His completely black eyes were so deadly-looking that Kalen thought she might have to take a step back out of sheer fright. Jagang waggled his fingers. "If I have to ask again, I'll kick her teeth in." In a flash, Kalen ran through everything she could think of. She felt like the man with the gray eyes must have felt when he deliberately fell face first into the mud. She had no choice either. Kalen laid the knife in Jagang's upturned palm. He grinned in triumph. "Why, thank you, darling." Without pause, he turned, as if driving his fist in a mighty blow, and slammed the knife right through the face of the man it belonged to. The damp air rang with a loud crack as bones shattered. The man collapsed dead into the mud. The flood of blood was shocking in the gray light. The man never even had time to scream before he died. "The knife back," Jagang called down to the corpse. His attention focused on the stunned faces of Kalen's special guards. "I'd suggest that you keep better track of your weapons than he did. If she takes a weapon from any of you, and she doesn't kill you with it, I will. Is that simple enough for you all to understand?" As one, they all said, "Yes, Excellency." Jagang bent and yanked the sobbing Jillian to her feet. He effortlessly held her up so that only her toes were touching the ground. "Do you know how many bones are in the human body?" Kalen choked back her tears. "No." He shrugged. "Neither do I, but I have a way to find out. We can start breaking her bones one at a time, counting each one as it snaps." "Please," Kalen begged, trying mightily to contain her sob. Jagang shoved the girl at Kalen as if he were giving her a life-size doll. "You are now responsible for her life. Whenever you give me any cause to be displeased, I'm going to break one of her bones. I don't know the exact number of bones in her frail little body, but I'm sure that it's a great many." He arched an eyebrow. "And I do know that I'm easily displeased. If you do more than simply displease me, I will have her tortured before your..." It's in the fine art of torture. The storms of gray shapes shifted in his inky eyes. They are very good at keeping people alive for a long time as they endure unimaginable agony. But if she should happen to die under torture, then I will have to start in on you. Kalen clutched the poor girl's bleeding head tightly to her chest. Jillian sobbed softly to Kalen how sorry she was for getting caught. Kalen gently shushed her. Do you understand me? Jigang demanded in a deadly calm voice. Kalen swallowed. Yes. He grabbed Jillian's hair in his big fist and started pulling her back. Jillian screamed with renewed terror. Yes, Excellency! Kalen shouted. Jigang smiled as he released the girl's hair. That's better. Kalen wanted more than anything for the nightmare to end, but she knew that it was only just beginning.